talk about a nation divided by war or civil war. And the thing you have to remember a little bit is I could probably do a 9-week lecture on this. I mean, there's that much to the Civil War. A lot of battles, a lot of strategies, etc. But obviously we don't have that kind of time if we're going to get to where we need to get. So I'm going to give you a very good history on the Civil War. I don't want you to feel cheated. The shortened version is 78 pages of my notes. And so by virtue of that, we will not have anything other than lecture this week, and then we'll see how next week goes because we don't have school on Friday, right? So we'll just lecture, that's what we're doing this week, and we will lecture Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Okay, first of all I want to tell you a story. I put the subtopic down as choosing sides in the Civil War. Well, it really came down to one person that was choosing sides in the Civil War. Anybody want to guess who I'm going to be talking about here? Jonathan, the new guy.
Winfield Scott.
No, he's using the ID sheets. He's catching on. Who am I talking about that had to make a choice in the Civil War? Going to have to make a choice here. Tough one. What? Who's going to have to make a choice on which side he's going to be on the Civil War? Robert E. Lee. Very good. And here's kind of the story behind this. On April 17th of 1861, the state of Virginia seceded from the Union. On April 17th of 1861, the state of Virginia seceded from the Union. Now, I want you to keep that date in mind because remember, during John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, who halted Brown's plans? Colonel Robert E. Lee, who was serving in the Union Army. Well, prior to April 17th, we've talked about this, Virginia was kind of teetering on whether to secede or not. It would matter if the Union took aggression against the South. Well, prior to April 17th of 1861, Colonel Robert E. Lee received a message from, as Jonathan said, General Winfield Scott, who was the overall commander of Union forces, and he asked him to come to his home. That would be Scott's home. So prior to April 17th of 1861, General Winfield Scott, overall commander of the Union forces, requests that Colonel Robert E. Lee come and visit Scott at Scott's home. Now, just so you know, Robert E. Lee and Winfield Scott were very good friends. Lee had served under Scott in the Mexican War, so they were very good friends. So Lee and Scott were very good friends. Lee had fought under Scott in the Mexican War. Well, when Colonel Lee arrived at Scott's home, the discussion began, and Lee was offered two things by General Scott. Anybody want to guess what General Scott offered Robert E. Lee? What are you offering? Civil War's coming up. What are you offering? Anybody want to guess? Very good. He offered to promote him from colonel all the way to general. Sorry, from colonel all the way to general. That was quite a promotion. And not only did he offer to promote him to the rank of general, he offered Lee overall command, ironically, of all Union forces in the Civil War. So when Scott met with Lee at Scott's home, he offered Colonel Robert E. Lee a promotion to the rank all the way to general, and also offered him overall command of Union forces in the Civil War. Well, what happened on April 17th of 1861? Virginia seceded from the Union. Whose home state is that? Robert E. Lee. So 3 days later, on April 20th, Robert E. Lee resigned from the United States Army after serving for 30 years. So, because Virginia seceded from the Union on April 17th of of 1861, 3 days later, on April 20th of 1861, Robert E. Lee resigns from the United States Army after serving our country for 30 years. Well, if you're Confederate President Jefferson Davis, what are you going to do as soon as you get the word that he has resigned from the Union? Go ahead. What are you going to do? You're going to bring him to your house and you're going to offer him what? A promotion to the rank of general in the Confederate Army and overall command of Confederate forces in the Civil War. So he has offered the exact same thing on opposite sides by Confederate President Jefferson Davis. As soon as Jefferson Davis hears that Lee has resigned from the Union Army, he offers him a promotion to rank of general and overall command of Confederate forces, which Lee accepts because he has chosen to fight for his home state of Virginia. Now, as you can imagine, when that horrible news reaches General Winfield Scott, historians state he was so upset he basically collapsed on his couch and said, "The United States has lost the very best officer in the service." So upon hearing the bad news of Lee's acceptance on the Confederate side, General Winfield Scott was said to have collapsed on his couch and said, quote, "The United States lost the very best officer in the service." The United States lost the very best officer in the service. Well, now it's May 20th of 1861, and how many Confederate states do we have? Remember from our lecture? 11. Very good. And we have 4 border states: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. I think we already talked about this. The question might be, what about that border state of Maryland? It's going to become the most important border state to both the North and the South, and the Union would rather Maryland come in on their side. That isn't looking too good, so they sure want to make sure they don't go to the Confederate side. Why would that be? Why would they care? What would be the importance of keeping Maryland neutral, if you look at it geographically?
Isn't it close to the capital?
Yeah, Washington, D.C. is like right here. If Maryland, the border state, goes into the South, you cut off the capital from what? The rest of the North. So it's really, really important, and geography's a little different now than it was then. But it was really important that Maryland did not go to the Confederacy, because that would mean that the Washington, D.C. would be cut off from the rest of the North. That would not be good. So Lincoln's going to do whatever he can to make sure at least Maryland stays neutral. It wasn't very easy, and I'll tell you why it wasn't very easy, because here's a couple of examples. There were a lot of Southern sympathizers that were living in Maryland, people sympathetic to the South, including all of the government officials in Maryland at the time, the people who were running the state, governor, congressmen, etc. They were also Southern sympathizers. That's not good for Lincoln in trying to keep Maryland neutral. And we had a couple of instances. First of all, a Union regiment was marching through Maryland, which is supposed to be neutral, and they are attacked by a mob of Southern sympathizers. And they're supposed to be neutral, right? You're not supposed to be doing that. So the first instance that Lincoln has to deal with is as Union troops are marching through Maryland, and it would be the same if Confederate troops were marching through Maryland, it was supposed to stay neutral. But as these Union troops were marching through Maryland, a large group of Southern sympathizers attacked those Union troops. In addition to that, these Maryland authorities, these guys that were running the government in Maryland who were Southern sympathizers, started to burn all the railroad bridges that connected Baltimore with Philadelphia. So two things Lincoln had to deal with in Maryland. First of all, a mob of Southern sympathizers attacked a Union regiment in Maryland, in Baltimore, by the way. And the second thing was these Maryland authorities, the people that were running the government that were sympathetic to the South, started burning all the railroad bridges that connected the city of Baltimore to the city of Philadelphia. Why would that be a problem? Because how are the Union going to transport their supplies? On those railroad lines. And Maryland's supposed to be neutral. So what does Lincoln do to solve that problem? Anybody want to guess? Those two problems, actually. What's he do? What's he send into Maryland? Troops. And they arrest all those mobsters, so to speak, that attacked the Union troops, and they arrested also all those government officials. How could they do that? Because Maryland had not done what? Seceded from the Union. They were still part of the Union, just plain and neutral. Although technically they still belonged to the United States of America, not the Confederate States of America. And Lincoln replaced those government officials in Maryland with people that had a little bit more pro-North attitude. Okay? So Maryland is a crucial state, and we'll come back to Maryland a little bit later, but I want you to know that Lincoln was having a little bit of trouble early with that particular state. So your question might be, there's 11 Confederate states. How many northern states were fighting against these 11 Confederate states? Anybody know? Take a guess. Twice, more than twice as many. 24 northern states. Now this is kind of interesting because we think of all the states are here, right? We have a couple over here too, California and Oregon, who has since been let into the Union as free states. They are also in the Civil War and providing troops from clear over here in the West. But when the Civil War gets after it, there were 24 northern states and 11 southern states. Now, let me ask you a question here. Any of you people have any relatives in Montana? Anybody in here have relatives in Montana? You do? How many people have friends in Montana? Or relatives? Friends or relatives? Okay, so can you imagine all of a sudden now we're going to have a civil war. And you're all of a sudden expected to hate and fight and kill all your friends and family in Montana because they are on the wrong side of things. Okay? This is how the Civil War was. Probably the most tragic part of the Civil War was pitting family against family, brother against brother, friend against friend. Changed relationships forever, where families never got along again. Now let me give you a really weird example of how this was family against family. Not a lot of people know this. Did you know that 3 of Mrs. Lincoln's brothers, that would be the president's wife's brothers, his brother-in-laws, fought and died for the Confederacy? Isn't that something? 3 of Mrs. Lincoln's brothers, the president's brother-in-laws, fought and died fighting for the Confederacy. And that's probably the saddest thing about the Civil War, is how this split families up. Lifetime friendships and all kinds of things, and we'll show you some examples of that later. But that's what the Civil War did, is split up a country, including families. Where brothers would be shooting against each other, or cousins. You're going to hear a story about Wesley Culp, who was going to fight for one side and die on his uncle's land that's owned on the other side. It's just kind of a crazy story. All right, that'll take us to our next subtopic then, which is northern advantages versus southern advantages. What advantages did the North have over the South, and what advantages did that South have over the North going into this Civil War? And then you can decide who you think had the overall advantage, okay? So, I'm going to give you 3 examples of northern advantages and examples of each of those 3, and then I'm going to give you 5 examples of southern advantages and examples of those 5, okay? This will be pretty important for your test, so make sure you get this. What would be the number 1 advantage the North would have over the South?
Resources.
What?
Resources.
Okay, you're both right and wrong. It's not the biggest advantage, but it's going to be an advantage. What's the biggest advantage? That won the war for the North, without question, before they ever started.
size of the population?
Population. Population was the biggest advantage. Population. We'll get to you guys in a minute, okay? Now here's something a lot of people don't know. The population of the North at the outbreak of Civil War was 22 million people. 22 million people lived in the North at the outbreak of Civil War. In the South, their population was 9 million. 9. 22 to 9. Keep in mind that 3.5 million of the 9 million people that lived in the South were, come on, slaves. Are they going to fight for the South? No. So look at the tremendous population difference. In essence, you've got 5.5 million in the South and 22 million in the North, if you take away the slaves. That alone, before we ever start talking about this, was the demise of the South. Simply population, numbers of men able to fight. Okay, so there's your first advantage. Now, what did you say, Izzy? Okay, economic resources. And that's kind of what you said too, wasn't it, Luke?
Sorry.
What'd you say?
Resources.
Okay, same, okay. Economic, we'll talk about that. Economic resources. That's the second advantage. How you doing, Jonathan? You all right? Okay. Now, when the war began, the North had 92% of the nation's industry. 92%. Is that a big advantage or what? Incredible. The ability to make things. 92% of the industry in this country was in the North. Not only that, the North had a huge percentage of all the coal and all of the iron and all of the copper and all of the other precious metals that will be needed to win a war effort. Those natural resources, so to speak, are all mainly located geographically in the North. So the South is at a huge disadvantage there. Now, what else did the North have that the South didn't? Money in the form of what? Not paper money,
Silver.
mainly close. Gold. So the North was money rich. What made up the wealth of the South? What two things made up the wealth of the South? What? I can't hear. Well, you're close. Land, which grows cotton, the land, and what was on that land that was worth a lot of money.
Cotton.
Well, something had to happen before it got grown. Who was helping grow that cotton? Slaves. So the North had money, gold. The South had wealth also, but their wealth was land and slaves. Now I'll give you a bad example, but I use it every year. I have a really good friend between Roberts and Red Lodge, Montana, and his name is Bill Stovall. And poor Bill is not a rich man. He always complained he didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. And he probably doesn't. He works horribly hard on his ranch between Red Lodge and Roberts to make a living. So he is cash poor and land rich. He could take that ranch tomorrow. If he put it on the market today, I'll bet you realistically by Friday, he'd get $10 million. There's no question in my mind. Beautiful area for hunting, beautiful area with the stream going through it. You ever been to Red Lodge? It's a beautiful area. He could sell that in a week for $10 million and never work the rest of his life, and neither would either of his kids. But why doesn't he do that? Because that's his homeland. That's where he grew up. That's where his dad grew up. He's not going to sell that land off, right?
Yeah.
He's going to work it. That's what his pride is. But he could do that in a minute. So it's the same thing here. The North had the gold. South, their wealth was their land and their slaves. They didn't have any money, really, for the most part. Who had all the money in the South? Plantation, right? So there's your second advantage. Your third advantage that the North has was simply transportation. Transportation. What's the main way of there's 2 ways to transfer things in the United States. How do you move things from one place to another?
Railroad.
Railroad and didn't have cars.
Horses.
No, that was a hard way. We use railroads now. How else would you move goods from New England to South Carolina?
Boats.
Right, right. Merchant boats or navy. So here's the examples of transportation. More than 70% of the railroad lines in the United States were where? In the north. Made it a lot easier for them to transport their troops and their supplies, their food, etc., to the men in the field than it would be the south. They controlled all of the transportation. Not all, 70%. That's why they were trying to burn those railroads in Maryland, okay? What else does the North control? The United States Navy and most shipping companies, which would ensure that they could carry on trade with foreign countries. And eventually, we'll talk about this, they're going to block all southern ports, so the little bit of shipping they have, they will not be able to get out to trade. So huge advantage transportation-wise. 70% of the railroads in the north, the United States Navy on the side of the north, and most shipping companies owned in the north. Big advantage, okay? So those are the three advantages the north had over the south and examples of each. Now we got to come up with 5 advantages that the south might have over the north. Anybody got a guess? Bill Stovall had it.
They're defending.
Southern pride. We'll get to that. Southern pride. What type of war are the Confederates going to fight this whole time? Offensive or defensive battle? Absolutely defensive. Their goal is to protect their own land. They're fighting for their homeland. Okay? They fought defending their own soil, defending their own families. They're going to fight a defensive war the whole time. You know what their thought process is? We'll fight and fight and fight in a defensive position. These northerners will get tired of it. They'll go home and they'll let us be our